listening to Breaking the Silence on the Fight the Lies Radio Network. Hello, and welcome to the debut episode of Breaking the Silence. I'm sitting here this evening recording this, and it's rather impromptu. I had planned on doing a solo show to explain a bit to new listeners. Me and my wife, Kelly, have a new podcast we just launched called Fighting the Lies, and she also has a solo effort that she has titled Pele Tenebris, and I had planned on doing one myself, and we're both doing the solo efforts just to sort of share our own personal thoughts as they come to us with the freedom of not being constrained with coordinating things together and all that. And some of us are more knowledgeable and able to engage in a dialogue about one subject and others another. So I've been thinking today about the nature of the question, what do we as human beings need saving from? Now, the obvious answers would be things like someone assaulting you and killing you, or a car accident, or even corrupt politicians. But I'm thinking more at a fundamental level. The thing that those who have religious beliefs would call salvation or eternal life, or if you're a transhumanist, you might just simply call it life extension. And it's a thing that I think all human beings have an intrinsic compulsion to seek out, a desire to end this thing that seems so unnatural, also known as death. So I guess I should start out by talking a bit about my life. Now, I've done an interview, a rather extensive one, on my good friend Brandon Schwinn's podcast called Cast 'Em Off Radio. I highly recommend it. He focuses on helping people be aware of the sorts of addictive patterns that we all have in different ways in our lives and being free of them. Well, anyways, this epic interview, which was intended to maybe be a couple hours, turned into 5 hours. Obviously, I have a knack for talking. So, moving on. I sort of had, well, not the easiest childhood. My dad was never around very much. He had problems with alcoholism, and well, he had a nasty little habit of cheating on my mom. And I really didn't know him very well. And as time went on, went into my teenage years, I had a lot of bitterness and things I never really got past. And yet, as I grew up to be an adult, I really didn't become a man at that point. Went through my 20s sort of trying to capture this childhood that I never really got to experience. As so many of us who grew up in the 80s and 90s can probably attest to, we sort of had this what's commonly called arrested development. Well, anyways, I had several near-death episodes from between the 90s and the turn of the millennium, and always sort of wondered, why am I still alive? And I might add that those near-death experiences, odds are, statistically speaking, I should have died. And I never could quite explain why I didn't, but I knew there was something that seemed to have intervened. Well, flash forward 2003, I met my wife, and within about 3 months we got married. And being unprepared for the realities of marriage, about a year into our marriage, things hit the rocks, and we were virtually on the edge of giving up and just calling it quits. And one thing led to another, and I came to the conclusion that for me, I needed help in a spiritual manner. We both had our baggage from our previous lives, relationships. As I mentioned, my father, and my wife had her issues with her parents, such as they were. And I knew, though, that I never successfully dealt with those things. Well, we also had our baggage with things of, shall we say, a darker spiritual nature that we dabbled in. Now, again, one person who does not have a spiritual worldview may not consider those things valid. So, I'm going to leave them out of the discussion for the time being. Well, flash forward to today, and me and my wife do hold what I would like to call a biblical worldview. And in that biblical worldview, we believe and embrace the interpretation that God manifested on this earth approximately 2,000 years ago in the form of a man named Yeshua, and that he lived a perfect life. He taught things that showed us all how to attempt to live some semblance of a sane, good life. And then he, in a singular moment of time, chose to sacrifice himself for all who would choose to embrace him being who he said he was, and promising to us that we would have eternal confidence in the fact that we had a way out of the death code. That's a short synopsis of who I am, where I'm at. So let's get back to the question. What do we as humanity need saving from? Now, to even come to the conclusion that we need this man, this Messiah, to save us, well, first we had to establish that he was even real, but that's not even the most foundational thing. We have to establish that there is an intelligent entity who exists outside of the space-time continuum as we know it, and that intelligent entity was the trigger for what we call the Big Bang, and that there was a fine-tuning, a guidance of the events that played out from the very first nearly infinitely small moments of time moving forward. Well, even as we speak of time itself is it's something that is part of this universe. It's woven into the very fabric of space, hence the term space-time. So in that sense, it really is hard for us to wrap our minds around that there was a point where there was no time, not just no matter. We kind of tend to have some idea, some notion of what things could maybe be like without matter, but without time, well, that's a whole nother can of worms. So this entity, this intelligence who exists outside of space-time, would have had to have triggered that event and guided everything that followed, brought order out of the chaos, and set the conditions for matter to even coalesce into clouds. Well, I should correct myself, energy to coalesce into a form of matter that then coalesced into clouds that then eventually clumped together into the protostars, which then, through the process of supernova, became the seeds for more stars, which then, according to current scientific theory, were drawn together by gravity wells that we term black holes and formed galaxies. And one of those galaxies is the one we call the Milky Way, that we on this planet Earth, orbiting a star that is one of approximately, I think last estimate, has somewhere between 200 and 300 billion stars in it. Who knows how many planets? We would have to come to the conclusion, in order to accept that we need some spiritual answers, some figure to save us, that this entity actually guided all this. And then beyond that, we need to then come to a conclusion that that entity was the very same trigger for the formation of life. Now, I'm not going to get into all the details and all the debates about life evolving, about how many would say it's mathematically, some would say it's inevitable. Others would say that it's nearly impossible that it would have happened by random chance. This is not what we're going to try to do tonight. What we're attempting to do is just lay a foundation, let's say, for the sake of those who don't have a spiritual worldview, let's just say we're going to play devil's advocate. No pun intended. So we have this intelligence who now has created life. Would it stand to reason that once that life, either through some natural process, reached a level of sentience, self-awareness, and intelligence enough to question its own existence, or if that said intelligent entity outside of space-time, aka God, had spontaneously, so to speak, created that intelligence, that self-awareness, that sentience, that thing that we consider so special about ourselves. And, honestly, today we found strong evidence to suggest many animals have a level of sentience themselves, that some animals have even recently, according to some scientific publications, showed signs of, interestingly enough, of having almost a religion. There was an article I read recently about multiple colonies of apes that they've observed building what, for all intents and purposes, look like altars and setting in front of them and setting other objects there as if almost, though this is merely an interpretation, as if almost giving an offering at this altar. Well, I'm infamous for rabbit trailing, so please bear with me. So we're going, for the sake of argument, assume this entity created intelligent life. Would it stand to reason that he did it for cheap thrills or no reason at all? Or would it stand to reason that he did it for a purpose? Would it stand to reason that an intelligence outside of space-time, and we're going to get to discussing that point and what the implications are of that later, but would it stand to reason that he would desire to create beings that had some small sliver of a capacity like his? Because think about it. If that intelligence who existed outside of space-time existed for what we would call eternity, a thing we really can't even wrap our minds around, because again, this is no time. Outside of space-time, what do you have? You can only have a singular thing existing, unchanging, because time is not present. There cannot be change with the very nature of that being. And, well, if something else existed alongside or with that intelligence, it would be in complete union with that intelligence. It would be existing in, for lack of better terms, because there is no space, so therefore there are no positions, physically speaking, but for lack of better terms, they would be existing in the same place. We're talking exact place down to the smallest decimal point of measurement, if that were even applicable. But we have to use metaphor in this circumstance because we have nothing else we can use. So, getting back, would it stand to reason that this intelligence would want to create beings that had some small sliver of what he has, which is thought, which is being and having values, having choices, having free will even? And if one could come to the conclusion that that might perhaps be something that's plausible, then would it also make sense that that being would want to have a relationship with those creations? After all, why else would he create them? The universe today as we know it, all of space-time, is in what science calls entropy. It's going from order to chaos, almost as if it's a great reversal of what happened after the Big Bang, chaos to order. And this entropy affects everything down to the smallest quantum matter up to the largest structures in the universe. Everything is, for lack of better explanation, coming apart at the seams, ourselves included. And this is what we call aging and death. Every moment that we breathe air, the cells in our body go through the process of oxidation, sort of like the soil on Mars is rusting. That's oxidation. And this, even beyond, never mind diseases, never mind mutations, which cause cancer, never mind toxins or anything else, just the act of breathing is killing us. So we, in a very real personal way, are experiencing the entropy of the universe. So would it stand to reason that it'd be natural that we would have an intrinsic desire to escape that, and that it would seem completely unnatural to us? I mean, anyone who's experienced the loss of a loved one or has experienced even the loss of a pet, there is a thought and a feeling that this should not be. Now, psychology will say that that's just simply a natural response because we grow attached to those we care about and that we can't reconcile the reality with what we would desire to be reality. They would also use the term cognitive dissonance, when what our image of reality is clashes with the reality that's shown to us. So let's move forward. If that intelligence had a desire to create a universe of beauty, of amazement. I mean, look at the universe now. It's a amazing thing. We're discovering things all the time. And, within even the most imaginable future of millions of years from now, the size of the universe, odds are we are not going to discover every intricacy of this universe. It quite literally goes beyond our imaginations. So if that intelligence created this universe and all the life in it, and to be a thing that's good, that's a work of art, that is the ideal design that he had in mind, then why are we experiencing what we are experiencing today? Entropy. Well, many religions, particularly the one that I prescribe to, would say that there was a moment in time, because we have free will, that we chose to go against the instructions of this intelligent creator, and that was what introduced chaos and entropy into the universe. Many people struggle with, why would God have allowed that to happen? Why would he have allowed death? Why would he have allowed mankind to have chosen evil? Well, that all simply goes back to free will. If you, as a man, meet a woman, would you rather have an artificial robotic wife, or would you rather have a living, breathing wife who is with you? That robotic wife has no free will. She only has what you programmed her to have, this adoration for you, this absolute loyalty to you. In the end of it all, would it mean anything? But the wife who's living, who's breathing, she has chosen to be with you in spite of all your flaws. Wouldn't that mean so much more? So, of course, my metaphor is pointing to, wouldn't a creator who created living, breathing beings to have a relationship with him, wouldn't he, despite the repercussions, wouldn't he give them free will, that choice? Because at the end of the day, nothing would matter otherwise. So, if these sets of events happened, would it not also stand to reason that that creator would at some point, with some being that he has created, that it's fallen into this state of entropy, would he not make an attempt to communicate, to say, hey, this is what's happened. This is what's happened to humanity. This is what's happened to every living, breathing thing. This is what's happened to the very structure of the universe. And this is who I am. And this is who you're meant to be. And there's a way out. Would it not stand to reason that a creator who cares for what he's created would do that? Let's suspend our arguments and disbelief once again and say that he did choose to do that. Now, there are two schools of thought in this intelligence from outside of space-time choosing to communicate with humanity. Actually, there's many more. It's always very nuanced when it comes to religion, but let's, for the sake of simplicity, say there are two. There is one school of thought that says that he would communicate with all of humanity wearing various, shall we say, masks, speaking languages that those differing people would understand, expressing things in ways that those differing people would understand, and showing them a way to him that those people would understand and be able to accomplish. Now, the 180-degree opposite of that is the thought that there was one clear communication to one people group expressing all of those things. I'm the creator. This is who I am. This is who you are. This is how you got here, and this is how you got into the state you're in, and this is the way out. Now, the former explanation for those divine communications would say that everyone has, no matter where they are, received these revelations from this intelligence, and that all those paths are paths to God equally. The other would say, no, he's only revealed himself one way, and there is only one way to him, and the rest are wrong. Now, one school of thought has to be right, and I would argue that it's a logical fallacy to say that all paths, that all, quote, revelations are equal and applicable at the same time. And here's the reason why. If one is to say that, then they are also saying that the one that says it is the only one is also a valid communication from this intelligence. If that were true, that intelligence is a psychotic, self-contradicting maniac. Or he's playing games with us, because how can he say two totally opposite things? If they were right, that would have to be the case. It would be the only logical explanation. And of course, that's completely illogical, in my opinion. If, however, the singular explanation, the one that says we have received an exclusive communication from that intelligence, if that one is right, then all of the rest are wrong, and there's no reconciling that. Now, I would argue that it makes far more sense that that explanation has much higher odds of being the correct explanation. Let's throw my beliefs aside. Let's throw, quote, faith aside. We're talking logic. We're talking mathematics. Which is more likely? So, that intelligence, for sake of argument, has communicated with one people group in a specific place in space-time because perhaps that one people group were receptive, were in the right place at the right time to hear the communication and to choose to listen and to also choose to believe it. And that people group, because of that intelligent entity, for lack of better terms, we'll say God. We could get much more precise in our terms. And quite honestly, I'm getting tired of saying a two-word phrase to title that entity. We'll say God. For the record, that is not at all a name. It's just a word that we as human beings in English have come up with to sum up the idea of this creator who exists outside of space-time. So let's further this discussion and say he chose this people group to communicate to. Maybe he tried many other ones, but this one people group were the ones who listened and who chose to embrace this communication. Because of that, he is using this people group as his vehicle for revealing his existence to the rest of creation, the rest of humanity. And in that, he's doing, as I said a way bit back, that he's describing who he is and why we were created and who we are and what happened to us and where he desires us to go in the far future. So would it stand to reason that he would, in some way, through perhaps different mechanisms, inspire human beings amongst this people group to document these communications, to write them down, to pass them on? Now, let's go to something a little bit more specific, something a little bit more documented in reality amongst researchers, amongst scientists. Many of them skeptics who set out to disprove the validity of what we call the Bible. But yet, in the end, they actually proved to themselves, in spite of what they were looking for, that this Bible is something more than just a mere book, just more than the mere writings of primitive people wandering around in the desert. What they found is that there is a unique structure to it, that Hebrew does not have a separate numbering system. It has, as a few other languages have, a structure called gematria. And what gematria is the use of letters to represent numbers. So if one were to use English as an example, A through Z would be 1 through 26. Well, in Hebrew, it goes essentially like that, but it steps up. Once you reach number 10, you go to the next decimal place and so forth. And so what they found is that there is a mathematical structure to the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. They found that in the original scrolls, there are no chapter breaks, there are no sentence breaks. It's all one continuous line of text, and it quite closely resembles today what we would look at and think of as computer code. Not only does it look like it, but when you convert the letters to numbers, it quite literally performs like it. And those numbers tell a story themselves. Those numbers point to patterns within that text. They have found that when they convert the Hebrew text to numbers and they do searches based
upon similar numbers, they find similar themes, they find similar statements throughout it. One example amongst many is that in the book of Leviticus, in the very center of it, is what's called the heart of Torah in Judaism. And it's a statement. And it's a statement that says that, and this is a dialogue from God saying, quote, "The life is in the blood. I have given it to you for atonement on the altar." What was found when applying gematria is that going right across that sentence vertically is the word Yeshua, which is the Hebrew name of the man commonly known as Jesus, the man who is said to have shed his blood in atonement for humanity. Very interesting, singular example of this pattern that we see in Torah. And it's not only in Torah, it's throughout the Tanakh, which is the rest of the Old Testament, as it's called. And what they found is that this numbering system that I've done a poor job at explaining, by the way, this numbering system goes beyond finding patterns and such. That because every letter represents a number and therefore every word is built upon those numbers, so every word has a total sum value. That they've also found that the words have a number value at the end that functions essentially exactly like what's called a checksum in programming language. That checksum in programming is the numbers that a person looking at the code can look and check and make sure that the code is valid, that it's not become corrupted, that there weren't changes introduced or code lost. They could find out where it got corrupted, and typically they can find out what it was supposed to be and correct it. Well, Torah and the rest of the Tanakh have that same checksum system in every word in those writings. And when one applies that, it's been found that the deviation from what Judaism has preserved as what they claim is the uncorrupted Torah, that they have preserved it to such a degree that the current text matches the most ancient of texts found in excavations. And they've also determined that they can ascertain any differences and tell what the correct word is supposed to be. Now, to say that such a system could have been developed by primitive men running around in the desert, disconnected from each other over the hundreds of years. I mean, it's a sum total of approximately 1,500 years from the time of Moses to the time of Yeshua or Jesus. So to say that those people could have created this thing with such precision, well, it would seem to be absolutely ludicrous. And those studying it who started out as skeptics have come to the same conclusion, essentially, and they have said that we would be hard-pressed to replicate such a thing today. Now, I said all that not to so much prove to anyone or attempt to prove to anyone that this thing that we call the Bible is absolutely true in exactly what it claims to be, because I've not given you any convincing data. I'm telling you things that, well, to be quite honest, I could be just making up. But in that, I would challenge you to do the research. I would challenge you to do a Google search. Look, men for thousands of years, scholars, men who hungered for knowledge, would travel the world. They would expend every resource that they had in their lives to find knowledge. I mean, men up until recent days wailed and lamented over the loss of the Library of Alexandria because it had this collective knowledge going back to even what was ancient times for them who existed when it was destroyed. During what we call the Dark Ages, again, mankind lost all of this knowledge. During the Renaissance and the period following that, the Age of Enlightenment, as they call it, up until the modern age, those things that were lost have been going through the process of being rediscovered. And not until our modern time, let's say since arguably the 80s, when us as common people were able to get our hands on computers, and then eventually in the 90s, the internet surfaced for the common person, we have this unique situation where we have more information at the tips of our fingers than humanity had for all of its history. So please do yourself a service and use that. Do the research. Don't take my word for anything. Whether you're an atheist or an agnostic or a Christian or a Buddhist or whatever you are, don't take anyone's word for anything. Research it and study it yourself. I am never the person to say to someone, well, God is real and the Bible's true, and then they ask me, well, how is that? How do you know that? And then to say, well, because the Bible says so, that's a logical fallacy once again. If you, as the atheist, don't believe the validity of the Bible, I can't use that to prove anything to you. Certainly no more than I can use my own words right now to prove anything to you. But what I'm attempting to do is use logic and reason and discuss what are the odds of such things. So moving forward, once again, we have this intricate communication that even today it's said that mankind would be very hard pressed to replicate. If that is a true statement, does it not line up with the concept of this infinite intelligence who exists outside of everything we know, having produced it, having communicated it, having, because he has accessibility to all points in space-time? Well, hey, if you've ever watched Doctor Who or any other good science fiction that deals with time travel and someone who is able to step outside of space and time and then go to any other point in space-time, Doctor Who being a wonderful example, then you could sort of appreciate what kind of ability that is, what kind of access that gives you. I mean, if you're the time traveler, you could go back in time and plant a tablet that some primitive person's going to come along that's going to contain some information to guide them to another step to find another tablet that you planted at another point in time, or perhaps their descendants find it. And you could go through time and lead these peoples on down this trail of crumbs up to the very point that you desire to lead them to. Because perhaps you knew that the planet was going to face a nuclear apocalypse and that you're going to do something about it because you have the power to do it. So in my little example here, I'm trying to convey, does it not make sense if we are to suppose and suspend our disbelief that there is this being we call God who exists outside of space and time, who has access to all points in space-time? Does it not make sense that he would lay that trail for us to follow and find to avoid the catastrophic fate that it would seem we're headed toward, that we would indeed all face? We all face death. And modern thought would say that we go into oblivion, that we go into nothingness, and that all of this, all of everything you've ever thought, felt, said, it all goes to nothing. That's what modern thought would say. And if it were not for the piercing into space-time by the one we would call God, then that certainly would be the unavoidable course. Now, of course, if one is to believe that said communication I've discussed extensively, then one also would have to believe that that being also told us that there is a place that many people simplistically just would call hell. Perhaps we could maybe ponder what that may be in scientific terms by thinking of maybe perhaps something like a black hole, maybe another dimension that exists layers down in the dimensions beneath us that is not in all a pleasant dimension. You know, modern physics, quantum physics, postulates the mini universe theory, the multiverse theory. And in that multiverse theory, the universe, or the structure that the universe exists upon, is a seething cauldron of bubbles, and all those bubbles are universes. And it would attempt to explain why we have a universe that matter could even form in, and why we have intelligence and everything else that we know today. It would attempt to explain that by saying that, well, that's inevitable when you have an infinite amount of universes in this seething cauldron. But you would have an untold amount of universes that were totally inhospitable to life, that matter could never form in, or perhaps are something that if one as a living being entered would be, well, something beyond any place as unpleasant as we can imagine for the existence of life. And if we have some nature to ourselves that transcends the physical body, then perhaps that part of ourselves is what could survive in that universe, that dimension. But what kind of survival would that be? So we've gone through all this to arrive to the point of postulating the possibility that that being we call God pierced into space and time, and in a way that we really can't grasp a hold of and understand, because let's not kid ourselves. No theologian, no human being at all can wrap their minds around the true nature of an infinite being. But somehow that infinite being says that I'm going to come into space-time. I'm going to come to this planet called Earth, and I'm going to give my physical life that I've embodied and separate myself from the infinite existence that I've known forever and go through that unimaginable torment of experiencing all that. Because think about it. If you are infinite and you've existed outside of space and time, you've never known death, you've never known entropy, you've never known any sort of corruption, you've never known pain, you've never known any of that. And to come into this and exist in this, and then to separate yourself from that, well, for lack of better terms, that infinite good, that in and of itself is an unimaginable torture, I would think. And then to experience what we call death. And through some way that we really can't fully appreciate or understand, said that all human beings who would choose across all of time to accept that as being a reality that actually happened, that choosing crosses that time, whether was months afterwards or years or 2,000 years as we are at today, that no matter where you're at in time, that you have this, for lack of better terms, this thread running through space-time, sort of like what we would describe as what a wormhole does. This thread that goes through the fabric of space and time to the singular moment in our space-time where this infinite being manifested on Earth and in a moment crossed over from existing in the physical reality of this universe to being back in the infinite. And that everyone who chooses to accept that has that thread connecting to that. And what are the implications of that? Well, in a simplistic, primitive kind of way, we could maybe sort of think that perhaps that thread follows through to outside of the universe, to this infinite, timeless location, and that ourselves, everything that we are, everything that we feel, everything that we think, what makes us us, our experiences, our loves, our pains, our knowledge that we've gained through this life, that all of that, that core that's really us, that quality that science can't measure, but knows is there, that part of us that some modern scientist in the transhumanist movement would hope and seek to somehow be able to connect it to a computer system and upload and preserve. Well, that part of us, perhaps when we choose to believe that being that we who believe in the Bible would call Yeshua or Jesus did indeed come into the space-time continuum and die for us, that we who choose that are following right along on a thread to existing outside of space-time. And all of us, everything that we are, is there. Now, I've gone through this long, probably at times confusing monologue here to arrive at maybe perhaps 2 points. One, explaining the question that I began with. What do we as humanity need saving from? We need saving from entropy. We need saving from ourselves, from the consequences of our free will. Much like the child who chooses to grab a hold of a burning hot frying pan, even though his parents told him not to, that it would hurt him. Well, what happens? Of course, the parents would run to that child and take care of him anyways, and heal their wounds and comfort them. We need saving from that fate, that is consequences, just like that child does. But there's another question that arises. If the message conveyed by Yeshua and his followers is to be believed, then in that singular moment in time when we sincerely, with our whole heart, our every fiber of our being, without doubt, say, hey, he's who this book and other people say he was, and he did this thing, And I accept that. And I accept that he is actually the creator of the universe, that he's always existed. And therefore, I have no choice but to want to submit to him, not in a way of like an overlord who would, proverbially slap you over the head and make you a slave, but submit to him in a sense of a father, just like a good son would look to his father and admire his father for everything that he's done and the house that he's built and the things that he provides for him, and choose to, obey his rules and then live the life that the father would tell him is best to live. So if they are to be believed and we do that, they say that, and by they, once again, I mean Yeshua and those who followed him, they say that our security in that existence for all of eternity outside of space-time as we know it is assured, that we can't have it and then lose it, that once we've chosen that, it's a done deal. And even though we still live in entropy and we're still subject to chaos and free will and bad choices, that if we truly, genuinely accepted that he atoned for that he paid the price for that he provided the way for us to escape that, then those mistakes, those flaws are already taken care of. Now, I said this was another question, because how can that be? Me, myself, when I first arrived at the conclusion that he was who he said he was and that I needed him, I believed, even previous to that, even previous to believing anything, at one time being an atheist and another time later being agnostic, not knowing what I believed. I believed, though, that if there is salvation, deliverance, escape from this flawed existence that we all live, then I believed that it stood to reason that we had to justify ourselves for that we had to somehow earn that in some way, maybe by doing good deeds or trying to live a good life and all that. Well, so I went through this whole dilemma for several years of essentially feeling like I had to keep all the instructions, all the commands that are laid out in Torah and the rest of the Tanakh, and also what is called the New Testament. And this was in large part because no one taught me anything otherwise. The people who I was being taught by, they were proponents of that very same belief. Well, I went through every day worrying, trying to not mess up, trying not to, as it's commonly called, sin, trying not to lose my salvation. And it was a miserable existence. I'm not going to say every moment was. Sure, for certain there were times of joy and peace and happiness and all of that. But I had this burden, this worry all the time in the back of my mind, which arose quite often. Well, through going through the thought experiments that I've been talking about here, I started to wonder if God exists outside of space-time, and if we, at some point, whether after our deaths in losing this mortal form we're in, or through some act in the future where he comes into this universe once again and takes us out, if at some point we are going to exist in that infinite, timeless place, for lack of better terms, outside of this universe, outside of space-time, then I came to the conclusion that in a very real way, and I do not mean that loosely, in a very real way, we are already there. And the us that you and me are right now, we're merely waiting to catch up. Because from the point of view of being outside of space-time, this is all played out. This has all already happened. See, that goes to another thought. There's this debate in Christianity. One side believes that everything is destined. It's predestined, that God has laid out the plan for our lives down to our choices and down to who will be saved and who won't. That's Calvinism. Arminians think that everything is completely free will and that God has in some way, in a real way, chosen to not know the future, to not orchestrate anything. And these two philosophies are at constant odds with each other. Well, in reality, looking at it from the point of view of trying to grasp a hold and imagine of being God existing outside of the universe, outside of time and space, then both are right and both are wrong. That he hasn't preordained, as they would say, the future. He's just already seen it. And from our point of view, this is very much akin to what Einstein described as relativity. From our point of view, it hasn't happened yet, but from his, it has. Just like if you were to watch a DVD, you have that DVD, it's sitting around your house. You can pick it up, you can look at it, you can take it, you can put it in the DVD player, and you can play it anytime you want to. And you can watch it to the end, you could pause it, you can rewind it. You can go to any point in time on that DVD you want to, and you could do it as many times as you want to. From the point of view, though, of the actors, if one were to play a thought experiment and pretend that those actors on that DVD are sentient thinking beings, literally on the DVD, then from their point of view, time's not pausing, time's not rewinding, it's not fast forwarding, and it hasn't ended yet. They're living it. But of course, from you, the viewer's point of view, well, as I said, you can go anywhere, anytime you want. You can watch that actor, that character who dies in a car explosion, die however many times you want to. And you know he's going to die. But you didn't cause it to happen any more than you caused anything else in it to happen. You just knew exactly what was going to happen. But let's say that you could go in and you could intervene and change events in that. A better example for that would be a video game that has a very well laid out set story. But you have sort of an open world and you can go around that world as a character and do whatever you want to do. And the NPCs, you know, some of the modern games, like say Skyrim, for example, very popular game. Those NPCs, some of them can roam that world and they have certain programming set in there to where they will go and perform certain tasks and do certain things. And they will react to other AI units in that game and make a choice and react a certain way. They'll flee or they'll fight or whatever. And yet you as the player, you can insert yourself in any place you want to and affect that world any number of ways. But as you're playing the game and as you finish it at the end, there is a set story that's going to play out. And there are some nuances that can be changed. And of course, you know, you have a save game system, so you can go back and redo things all over again. And you can go back and save that one character who you didn't want to see die. Well, the point being is that if there is one called God who exists outside of space-time, then in a very real way, he can do the exact same thing, except he has a rule that he's placed on himself that says, I will not take away from anyone's choice to do whatever it is that they want to do. Unfortunately, they're going to suffer the consequences of the bad choices. And unfortunately, they're also going to suffer the consequences of others' bad choices. That's what you have when you have a free will universe. That's all you can have. So again, I ramble. Where I was at was saying, I came to the conclusion that I was wrong about salvation, about earning it, about securing it, because I had this thought experiment that brought me to the conclusion, and it wasn't the only thing, but it's a very good way of explaining things here tonight. And that is that if at some point, whether it's tomorrow or when I'm 90 years old, if at some point I transition over and go outside of the space-time, I'm already there now. And that me is just waiting for this person, this version of me, who's stuck in temporal reality to catch up. So therefore, if that me who's there now from his point of view is outside of space-time and in union with God, well, remember that whole point I made earlier about God existing outside of space-time and there being no change and there being no, as we would say, locality? Everything has to exist in, for lack of better terms, the same space. So that means that we who would pass to there, that we are existing in the same place as him, the one who's infinite, the one who's perfect, the one who is not flawed, the one who has never known corruption, the one who created it all. And that also means by necessity that no one can exist there who is going to become corrupt, because they can't exist in the same place as him, at least according to what he has said. And they cannot change and become corrupt because you can't have change without time. You can't have a change of state from one to the other. And also, it would imply, if one were going to come to another conclusion that's quite the opposite, it would imply that that infinite perfect being is somehow lacking foreknowledge that that said person who did become corrupt, who's existing right there mixed in with him in the same place. It would imply that he didn't know that was going to happen and he allowed them to come out to infinity. Well, that's quite absurd. And so if that cannot be the case, that means that me who's outside will always be there. And that means that me, who exists in temporal reality here today, cannot fail to reach that point. Because if I'm already there, guess what? I'm already there. And that means that at some point in the future, I arrive there, which means no matter what I do today, if I have truly chosen to accept all of that as being reality, then that means that no matter what I do, I can't ruin that. I can't lose that. I can't corrupt that. And it kind of makes sense to think that a being as good and as perfect as the one we call God would understand us being trapped here in this mess, would make mistakes, and that he actually loves us and cares enough for us as his children to take our hands after we've burned our hand on that burning hot iron skillet and take care of it, and not beat us and punish us and kick us out of the house because we made a mistake and maybe we chose to even and grab that skillet that he warned us not to grab. Well, I hope all of this had some meaning for somebody listening here at whatever point in space-time you happen to be. As I said, this was impromptu. It was just thoughts that I had going over in my head today, and I had been trying to decide what I was going to do for my first show, and I wanted to get something out in a reasonably quick amount of time. And this came to my mind as probably the most important topic to talk about. Why do we need to be saved? And how can we know that we are? And I would just say that despite what religion tells you, despite what all these awful examples of these ridiculous clowns, the shows that they would put on TV, you know the ones I'm talking about, the televangelists, or the people who would claim to have that same truth wherever you may encounter them. Despite what they would say, reality is much bigger than their limited explanation for it. God's much bigger than a little building somewhere, or even a big building somewhere. He's much bigger than some cultural expression shown here in America or whatever other nation that would presume somehow to be a reflection of that infinite being. Even the Israelites, the Hebrew people who, if we are to believe it, received that revelation, they weren't some divinely mandated culture. It wasn't like God beamed down this culture, this Hebrew culture, with all of its nuances. As much as I love them, it wasn't like he created that. He took a people that were a certain people and instructed them, as I said earlier, about himself, and used what existed there in them. And he gave them guidelines, knowing how they lived, their cultural expressions. And so those truths about him are expressed through that lens of that cultural expression, but still that cultural expression is not the infinite God. So how much less is our example of God that we see here in America today? Now, I don't mean to condemn anyone, because in reality, no one can really be condemned any more than another in as far as our simplistic flaws and our limited understandings. But I merely would say to those who have never bought what those people are selling, because to them it leaves a bad taste in their mouth, I would say to you who feel that way, that there's probably a good reason that they did leave a bad taste in your mouth. Because they're not God. They're merely these flawed vessels that, despite their flaws, that God has chosen to use as vehicles to deliver the message that he has conveyed. Well, where I'm at right now in space-time, it's getting late, and I have to get up to go to work in about 4 hours and a few minutes. So probably to many people's joy, I'm going to cut this off here and just say, Again, I hope this meant something to people listening and that it made some kind of cohesive sense. And really, thanks for bearing with me. Thanks for listening. Thanks for just maybe giving some of these things thought. Even if you're a believer, I think there's some value in looking at things this way and being able to grasp them this way and understand them this way and explain them this way to people who aren't believers. Because our religion, our cultural expressions, even our statements that say things are true because the Bible says so, guess what? It's not going to prove anything to you. So that's a challenge I would give everyone tonight. Use the tools that you have on hand, this great wealth of knowledge. There's a quote from, ironically, a favorite band of mine even today, whose singer is quite an avowed atheist, Bad Religion. And the quote goes, "With such a wealth of information, why are you so poor? Don't be poor." Good night, and thanks for listening. Until next time, this is Mike with Breaking the Silence. Breaking the Silence is a production of Fight the Lies Ministries. Visit us at ftlradio.net. Find us on Facebook and YouTube by using the search term Fight the Lies Radio. This program is released under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. Intro and outro music by Kevin MacLeod at incompetech.com.